Our next topic for tactics is called stalemate. We already know what stalemate is. It's when one person can't make any legal moves. Surprisingly, though, this is actually a tactical idea that one can use to just save a draw in cases where one would be easily losing. So if we look at this position right now, it seems like white's not doing so well. White has his king on g4, and it's white to move. It seems like it's Suggs bomb because if he plays king to h5, like king to h5, king g3, king h3, no matter what he plays with his king, he'll lose the pawn on f5. And it seems like if he plays the move h5 to not move his king and lose the pawn, then black can play the waiting move, king e5. And now either white would be forced to give up his h-pawn by playing a6, or give up his f-pawn by moving his king somewhere else. However, it turns out here that white is not lost. Turns out that white, if he plays king h5, black here is forced to play king takes f5, and this would be stalemate. If black doesn't play king takes f5, say he plays, let's say, king f4, then white can play king g6 and actually win the pawn on g7. This actually wins white the game. Therefore, after king h5, black, again, is forced to take on f5. White has no legal moves with his king. He can't go here because the pawn. These three squares are covered by black's king. And, of course, the king blocks the pawn, and the pawn blocks the king. This would be a draw. Another example here, in this position, it would be black to move. And black wants to take a draw because if black otherwise moves his rook, let's say he moves his rook somewhere normal like rook f3, then at least white can take the pawn and white will be up a pawn. Of course, black wants an easy draw immediately. So if black wants to draw, there's no reason to not take on rook takes b3. At first sight, it looks like it loses a rook. But after white takes, you realize that it's stalemate. This pawn can't move on c5 because it's blocked by c4. Once again, the king and pawn block each other. And the king covers these two squares, the pawn covers this square, and the rook covers the b6 square. Black's king has nowhere to go. Once again, this would be stalemate. Black easily gets a draw. Now in this position, it seems like white's down a lot of material. Black's got a queen and a bishop for the rook. So that's like what, 10, 13 versus 5, so that's like an 8-point advantage. Seemingly decisive though, but turns out white has one resource here that can grant him the draw. Now, white's rook is attacked. If he moves his rook somewhere, let's say rook to c3, somewhere normal, then black will checkmate white very, very quickly. Queen f2 check. The only move is king h3, and now we can just go bishop 4. This is checkmate. But white can play the move rook takes d3. Rook takes f3. Rook takes f3. This actually forks the king and the queen. And even though it does give up in exchange, the problem is after queen takes f3, turns out that it's stalemate. White's king has nowhere to go, and white gets this draw. Notice that once again, black had no choice but to take on f3. He can't avoid this because if he moves his king, obviously white will take the queen and win the game himself. Now in this position, white's also supposedly losing because white is down 3 pawns. In this endgame though, white has another trick. Queen endgames are very tricky because the queen has the option to give checks, and the king needs to be able to find a way to get out of them. Here, in particular, it turns out that one check is especially useful. This check is queen d6 check. The idea here isn't just to give up the queen and lose the game. I know it seems like it will be quicker, but after queen takes 6, the game actually ends in stalemate immediately. Once again here, you would see that black has no way to get out of this check without losing his own queen, unless he takes the queen on d6. So black is forced to get into stalemate, d6. One more problem. Right now, it seems like black's pawn is going to promote very soon, and white will not be able to catch up to it with his rook. The rook's stuck on b7. It can't go to c7 because the king's guarding the square, and obviously it can't go to b1 because the pawn can capture the rook. Well, how do we save the draw here? Queen versus rook is definitely a win for black, so white needs to find something pretty quickly. Now, moving his rook to some random place, let's say rook to b3, doesn't exactly help because after c1 queen, there's really no good way to trade off the rook for the queen or anything like that. However, white has one little trick here that he can use. He can play the move rook to b5. After rook to b5, if black decides to get a queen, then the rook can play the c5 check, and black forced to take with stalemate. Notice once again, this is almost like a fork. White's rook forks the king and the queen, forcing black to take with the queen, and in that case, white will get stalemate. Of course, if black promoted to a rook here, If c1 was a rook, then we do not need to play rook to c5, losing a rook. Simply king rook versus king rook should be drawn easily. Stalemate is an interesting trick. It sometimes is overlooked because it seems counterintuitive, losing a rook or some other piece for free. However, it's a quick way to get a draw, especially when one person's down a lot of material. So always be on the lookout for stalemate ideas, especially in the endgame.